A screen door slammed so hard the glass rattled. A man stumbled out onto the porch, gripping the railing with both hands. His knees buckled. He went down onto the wooden boards hard and stayed there. Across the gravel road, a beagle started barking. It bolted off a porch and shot across the road toward him. An old woman dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered on the steps. She grabbed her coat and ran after the dog, calling a name into the morning. The man on the porch wasn't moving. He'd been alone in that house for 3 days. No lights, no sound. Nobody had seen him. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell, and she was 62 years old, and she had no idea she was about to run into the rest of her life. What she found on that porch changed everything. Stay with me on this one. But let me back up, because to understand that morning, you have to understand the 3 days before it. Eleanor Hartwell had taught 4th grade in Millbrook, Ohio, for 34 years. She'd retired 8 years back, and 2 years after that, she'd buried her husband. His name was Tom. He died in the spring, the way good men sometimes do, quietly and too soon, sitting in his chair with the newspaper folded on his knee. 1 minute he was there. The next minute the house was too big. Now here's the thing about a house that's suddenly too big. You learn its sounds. You learn which board creaks. And you learn, whether you want to or not, how to fill a whole day with almost nothing. Eleanor filled hers with the garden, the church quilting circle, and a fat old beagle named Biscuit who had been Tom's dog first and hers by default. Biscuit was 13, gray in the muzzle, bad in the hips, with a nose that still worked better than any alarm clock. Where Eleanor went, Biscuit followed, one slow step behind. The farm sat at the end of Sycamore Road, a gravel stretch with only 2 houses on it, hers and the one across the way. For years that other house belonged to the Petersons. Then old Mr. Peterson passed, the place sat empty a good while, and in the fall a moving truck came. The new neighbor was a man named Cliff Dawson. Eleanor learned that much from the mailbox and from Doris at the post office, who knew everything. Cliff was 64. He'd run cattle out past Fenton his whole life. And his wife, a woman named Ruth, had died that summer, cancer. The kind that takes a person slow and takes the one caring for them right along with it. So he'd sold the ranch. Couldn't stand to be there without her, folks said. He'd moved to the little house on Sycamore Road to be near nothing at all. Eleanor understood that better than most. She'd waved at him once that first week across the gravel. He'd lifted a hand. That was it. A man doesn't move to the end of a dead-end road because he wants company. But there's neighborly and there's watching. And Eleanor, without quite meaning to, started watching. She noticed the truck never moved. She noticed no lights came on at supper. She noticed the porch light stayed dark and the newspaper piled up at the end of his drive. 1, 2, 3 days in a row, the rubber bands still on them. On the 3rd evening, she stood at her kitchen window with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and she looked across the road at that dark house, and something in her chest went tight. Because she knew that dark. She'd lived in that dark. There's a certain quiet that settles over a house when the person inside has stopped believing tomorrow is worth getting up for. She'd felt it in her own hallway the year after Tom. The dishes stack. The mail stacks. You sit in one chair and the light goes gray and then black around you, and you don't move to turn on a lamp, because what's the point? There's no one coming. Eleanor set her tea down. "Biscuit," she said, "we're going to do something foolish." Now understand, Eleanor Hartwell was not a woman who barged into other people's grief. She'd been raised to knock soft and leave folks be, but she'd learned something the hard way in her own worst year. The people who saved her weren't the ones who said the right words. They were the ones who just showed up, who put a casserole in her hands and wouldn't take no, who sat with her and didn't need her to be okay. Nobody was doing that for the man across the road. She could see it plain as day. Nobody was coming for Cliff Dawson, so she'd go herself. She didn't have a casserole, but she had apples from her own tree and a recipe she knew by heart because it had been Tom's favorite. Apple and cinnamon, with a lattice crust and a little brown sugar brushed on top so it went dark and sweet at the edges. Tom used to say she should sell them. She hadn't made that pie in 2 years, because the smell of it filled the house with a man who wasn't there. That night she made it anyway. She peeled the apples at the counter while Biscuit snored under the table, and the kitchen filled up with cinnamon and warm butter. And for the first time in a long while, the too big house didn't feel quite so empty. The stakes were simple and they were real. A man was going dark across the road, the same way she almost had. A pie is a small thing, but sometimes a small thing is the only rope you've got to throw. She baked it that night and let it cool. And in the morning early, she wrapped it in a clean dish towel, still warm from a low oven, and she crossed the gravel road with Biscuit trotting one step behind. She knocked on Cliff Dawson's door. Nothing. She knocked again. She heard at last the slow drag of feet. The door opened and the man who stood there stopped her cold. Cliff Dawson was a big man, or had been. Broad through the shoulders, tall, a rancher's build. But he looked like something had been let out of him. His shirt hung loose. His face was gray and unshaved, and his eyes had that flat, hollow look she recognized from her own bathroom mirror. He hadn't slept. Maybe he hadn't eaten. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger through fog. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a rasp. "Eleanor," she said, "from across the road. I brought you a pie." He looked at the bundle in her hands like he'd forgotten what pie was. "I didn't mean to bother you," she went on, gentle, the way she used to talk to a scared child on the first day of school. I noticed your lights have been off, and I know how that goes." Something flickered in his face, just for a second. "You don't have to let me in," she said. "You can take this and shut the door and I'll never mention it, but I made too much and Biscuit here doesn't care for apples, so." She held it out, and here's where it turned. Because Cliff Dawson looked down at that pie, wrapped in a faded blue dish towel, and the steam came up off it in the cold morning air and the smell reached him. Cinnamon, warm crust. And whatever wall that man had built over 3 dark days, that smell went right through it. His chin trembled. This big rancher, this man who'd probably not cried once at his own wife's funeral because men his age were raised not to. His eyes filled. He put one hand over his mouth. "Ruth used to make one just like that," he said. "Well then," Eleanor said softly, "you'd better let me put it on a table." He stepped back and let her in. The house was dark and cold, boxes still stacked in the hall from the move he'd never finished, dishes in the sink, a recliner facing a television that wasn't on. She'd seen it before. She'd lived it before. She didn't say a word about any of it. She just found the kitchen, set the pie down, opened one shade to let in a little light, and put the kettle on like she'd been doing it in that house for years. Cliff sat down heavy at the kitchen table. He watched her move around his kitchen, and he didn't tell her to stop. "You take coffee?" she asked. "Or you a tea man?" "Coffee," he said. "There's some in the cabinet there." She made a pot. She cut 2 slices and put them on 2 plates she found and washed first without comment. She set one in front of him. Biscuit settled his old bones under the table against Cliff's boot, and the man reached down without thinking and scratched the dog's ears, and something in his shoulders came down 1/2 an inch. They ate pie in a cold kitchen with the light coming up gray and then gold through the one open window. He didn't talk much at first. Then he talked a little. About Ruth, 41 years married. How she'd been the one who talked to people, who remembered birthdays, who knew the neighbors. How he'd never had to learn any of that because she did it for both of them. And now she was gone and he didn't know how to do the simplest thing. Didn't know how to answer a door. Didn't know how to fill a Tuesday. "I sold the place," he said. "The ranch. 60 years my family had that land. I sold it in a week because I couldn't walk out to the barn without expecting her to holler I was late for supper. He shook his head. Moved out here to the end of nowhere. Figured I'd just wind down quiet. I know that word, Eleanor said. Quiet. I've done my share of quiet. He looked at her then, really looked, like he was seeing her for the first time. You lost somebody. My Tom, 2 years ago this spring. How'd you get through it? And she told him the truth. I didn't for a long while. I sat in my house in the dark, same as you. And then one day a woman from the church knocked on my door with a chicken pot pie and wouldn't leave, and I hated her for it. She smiled. And then I loved her for it, because she reminded me the door still opened. That's all. Somebody just has to remind you the door still opens. Cliff Dawson looked at the pie on his plate. He looked at the old woman across his table who'd made his dead wife's dessert without knowing it, and at the old dog against his boot, and at the light coming through the window he hadn't opened in 3 days. And this quiet, hollowed-out man laughed. It came out of him surprised, half a laugh, rusty, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. Then he shook his head and wiped his eyes with the back of his big, rough hand, and he said the thing. You know what, Eleanor Hartwell, he said. If I were 20 years younger, I'd marry you. Bake a man a pie like that and joke about it and fix his kitchen and put up with his crying. Lord, 20 years younger, I'd marry you on the spot. Eleanor laughed too. She waved a hand at him. 20 years younger, you wouldn't have looked at me twice. Now eat your pie. That was all. A joke between two lonely old people over coffee. It meant nothing, and she knew it meant nothing, and she was glad only that she'd gotten one laugh out of him, because one laugh is how it starts, the door opening. She stayed another hour. She washed his dishes over his protests. She opened his shades and showed him where she'd left the rest of the pie in the fridge, and she made him promise to eat something real for supper. Then she gathered up Biscuit and said she'd best get on, and Cliff walked her to the door. And for the first time in 3 days, when she looked back from the road, there was a light on in that house. She went home warm all the way through. She made herself lunch. She worked in the garden all afternoon. She read in her chair as the evening came down soft over Sycamore Road, and she thought, that poor man, I hope he's all right, and she went to bed sure that a pie and an hour of company was the whole of the story. It wasn't, not even close, because the next morning before the sun was full up, Biscuit started scratching at the kitchen door. Eleanor came down in her housecoat, half asleep. There was something on her porch. A small wooden box worn smooth at the corners, tied with a bit of twine. A recipe box, and tucked under the twine a note in careful, blocky handwriting. She picked it up. It said, these were Ruth's. She'd want somebody to use them. Come teach me the pie if you've got the time. No rush. Cliff. Eleanor stood on her porch and held that box and felt her throat go tight, and she smiled. And that's when Biscuit tore out of her hands and off the porch, barking his old head off, and shot across the gravel road toward Cliff Dawson's house. Because Cliff Dawson was down on his porch and he wasn't getting up. If you're still with me, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one about the people the world forgets, the widows and widowers at the end of quiet roads, they only reach folks when you help them along. So subscribe and stay with me, because this is where everything changed. Eleanor ran, 62 years old, in her housecoat and garden shoes, across the sharp gravel, her heart slamming. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was on his side, gray-faced, his lips a bad color, one hand pressed to his chest. He was breathing, but wrong, shallow, and quick. Cliff, look at me. She got a hand under his head. His eyes rolled toward her, unfocused, then found her. Where does it hurt? Chest, he got out. Arm came out to leave he grimaced. Leave the box, went end. Don't talk, don't you talk. She had her phone in her housecoat pocket, thank God. 34 years of teaching had made her a woman who kept a phone within reach. She dialed 911 and she did not let her voice shake. Address, symptoms, age, everything the operator asked, clear and fast, one hand smoothing the hair back from that big gray forehead the whole time. Then she held his hand and she talked to him. Not about dying, about living. You listen to me, Cliff Dawson. You are not doing this. You hear me. You just opened your shades yesterday. You just laughed. You do not get to open the door and then go and quit on me. That is not how it works. Her voice cracked and she didn't care. I got your box. I got your note. You want me to teach you that pie? You have got to stay right here and keep breathing because I do not teach a class to an empty chair. You understand? His hand tightened on hers, just barely, but it tightened. The nature of this whole thing had changed, and Alina felt it change under her hands. Yesterday it had been kindness. A pie, a laugh, a door opening. Now it was life and death on a cold porch, and the man she'd only just met was gripping her fingers like she was the only thing keeping him on the earth. And maybe she was. The ambulance came screaming up Sycamore Road 9 minutes later. 9 minutes. Alina counted every one. The paramedics were young and fast, and they had him on oxygen and a monitor in under a minute. And one of them said the word she was dreading, heart attack, and the other one said, we gotta move, and they had him on the gurney and loaded before she'd even stood up all the way. You family? The young one asked her over his shoulder. Alina opened her mouth. She wasn't. She was a neighbor of 2 days. She was a woman who'd baked him a pie. By every rule of the world, she was nobody to Cliff Dawson at all. Yes, she said, I'm coming. And she climbed into the back of that ambulance in her housecoat and garden shoes, and she held the hand of a man she barely knew all the way to the county hospital, 22 miles, while the monitor beeped and the young paramedic worked, and the fields of Millbrook blurred past the little back windows. Now here's what I need you to understand about the hours that followed. They took Cliff back through the doors where she couldn't go, and a nurse pointed her to a waiting room with orange chairs, and there she sat. In her housecoat, with nobody's phone number, with Biscuit, she suddenly realized, still shut out on her own porch 22 miles away. She sat there and she thought about how strange a thing life is. 2 days ago she didn't know this man. Now she was the only soul on earth waiting to hear if he lived or died. No children came running. No sister called. Ruth was gone and the ranch was sold, and Cliff Dawson had moved to the end of a dead-end road specifically so that no one would have to grieve him. And Alina thought, not on my watch. Not while I've got 2 good legs and a car and a pie recipe. Nobody dies alone at the end of my road. A doctor came out after 2 hours. Tired eyes, kind. He asked if she was Mrs. Dawson. She said she was his neighbor, and she was all he had. The doctor seemed to decide that counted. He had a heart attack, the doctor said. A real one, but you got him help fast, and that made all the difference. Another 20 minutes on that porch and we'd be having a different conversation. He let that sit. We put in a stent. He's stable. He's going to be sore and scared, and he's going to need to change some things, but he's going to live. Alina put her face in her hands and cried, right there in the orange chair, for a man she'd known for 2 days. Then she wiped her face and asked when she could see him. They let her in that evening. He was small in the big white bed, tubes and wires, but his color was back, that terrible gray gone out of his face. His eyes were closed. She sat down in the chair beside him, and she didn't want to wake him, so she just sat. After a while, without opening his eyes, he said, "You're still here." "Where'd I be?" "Home." "It's late, it's 20 miles. 22, she said. "And Biscuit's got a doggy door, he'll survive 1 night. Hush." Cliff opened his eyes and turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen yet. Not the fog, not the grief, something raw and open and frightened. "Nobody's ever done that," he said. What you did. Ruth did for everybody her whole life, and when she got sick, I sat with her every day for 11 months, and I'd have done it 11 years. But nobody ever sat with me. I moved out here so I wouldn't put that on anybody. So I could just go quiet and not be a burden to a living soul. His eyes filled. And you climbed in the ambulance in your bathrobe. House goat, Alina said. There's a difference. He laughed and it hurt him, and he pressed a hand to his chest, and he laughed anyway. I was serious, he said. Yesterday, at the table, I made it a joke because a man my age has got to make it a joke, but I sat in that dark house for 3 days wishing I could just stop. And then you knocked on my door with Ruth's pie, and I thought, well, maybe one more day, and then you climbed in that ambulance. He shook his head against the pillow. I meant it, Alina. 20 years younger, I'd have married you. Alina took his hand, the old rancher's hand, rough and scarred and shaking. She held it in both of hers. Cliff, she said, I'm 62, you're 64. Between the two of us, we haven't got 40 years left if we're lucky, and you just proved we might not have 40 minutes. She looked him square in the eye. So I'm going to say something, and you can call me a foolish old woman, but I've buried one good man, and I know exactly what I'm looking at when I see another one. I don't want you 20 years younger. I want you exactly as old and broken down and scared as you are right now. Because that's the man who left a recipe box on my porch and a note asking for one more day. The room went quiet except for the soft beep of the monitor. You don't have to be 20 years younger to marry me, Alina said. You just have to get out of that bed. Cliff Dawson looked at her for a long moment. And then this big man who'd sold his family's land so no one would have to grieve him, who'd gone to the end of a dead road to disappear, brought her hand up to his face and pressed it to his cheek, and he wept. And she let him. And she didn't say a single word, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just be there, while a person feels the whole weight of not being alone anymore. She drove home at midnight. Biscuit met her at the door, indignant. She slept 4 hours and drove the 22 miles back at dawn with coffee and a clean shirt for Cliff and the recipe box on the seat beside her. He was sitting up. He looked 10 years younger. Cliff Dawson came home to Sycamore Road 11 days later. And I'll tell you how I know all the small things that came after, because Alina told them to my mother, who told them to me, in a town where nothing stays secret and the good stories least of all. She didn't let him go back into that dark, cold house alone. She'd been over there the whole time he was in the hospital. She'd opened every shade. She'd unpacked the boxes that had sat in the hall since fall, found his coffee mugs and his winter coat, and at the bottom of one, a framed photo of Ruth, laughing, that she set on the mantel where he'd see it every morning. She stocked his refrigerator with the heart-healthy food the doctor's list said, and she learned to cook without the salt and the butter she'd used her whole life, and it wasn't as good, and they both agreed it wasn't as good, and they ate it anyway. She was there every day. She'd cross the gravel road in the morning with Biscuit trotting behind, and she'd make his breakfast and check that he'd taken his pills, and they'd sit on his porch, the same porch he'd gone down on, and drink weak decaf and watch the light come up over the fields. And in the afternoons he started walking, the way the doctor said he had to, slow laps up and down Sycamore Road, and after a week she was walking beside him, and after 2 weeks he was holding her hand while they walked, and neither one of them made a joke about it. The town noticed, of course. Doris noticed. The quilting circle noticed. And people talked, some of them kind and some of them not. 62 and 64, folks said, carrying on like teenagers, and her Tom barely cold, his Ruth barely gone. There were a few in that church who thought a widow ought to stay a widow, that love had an expiration date and they'd both passed it. Alina heard the talk. She taught half those gossips in the 4th grade. And one Sunday, when a woman she'd known 40 years said something soft and cruel about it in the church kitchen, Alina set down her coffee cup and said, loud enough for the room, "I found a man alone in the dark who'd given up on living, and I gave him a reason to get up in the morning, and he did the same for me. If the good Lord's got a problem with two lonely people keeping each other warm at the end of their lives, he can take it up with me directly. In the meantime, pass the sugar." Nobody said another word about it, not to her face. Here's the thing about the joke he made that first morning over pie. "If I were 20 years younger, I'd marry you." People say a thing like that to be safe. They wrap the truest thing they've got inside a joke so that if it falls, it only falls as a joke. Cliff Dawson had been telling her the truth in the only way a frightened old man knew how. And the real miracle was that he lived long enough to say it again without the joke. He said it in the spring, almost a year after the pie. They were on the porch, and the apple tree in Alina's yard across the road was in bloom, white flowers all over it, and Biscuit was asleep in a patch of sun. And Cliff, who was strong again now, brown and steady, reached into his shirt pocket and took out a ring. It wasn't fancy. It had been his mother's. He'd been carrying it around for a month. Alina found out later, waiting for a day that felt right. "I'm not 20 years younger," he said. "I'm a year older than when I said it, and I've got a stent in my heart and a list of foods I can't eat, and I snore. You've told me I snore." His voice was rough. "But I'm not in the dark anymore. You did that. You knocked on my door with a pie and you would not let me quit." He held out the ring in his big steady hand. "I don't want the 20 years I don't have. I want the ones I do, all of them, with you. Would you marry me, Alina Hartwell?" And Alina, who had buried one good man and been sure she'd used up her whole ration of love, who had learned to fill a too-big house with a garden and a quilting circle and an old dog, looked at the second good man of her life holding out his mother's ring under a blooming apple tree, and she said yes before he'd even finished asking. They married that summer. Small. In Alina's backyard under the apple tree with the same few dozen folks from town, the kind ones and the ones who'd gossiped both, because that's a small town for you, everybody comes in the end. Biscuit wore a bow tie and slept through the whole ceremony. Alina wore blue. There was pie instead of cake, apple and cinnamon, a dozen of them, and every single guest said they'd never had better, and Alina said the recipe wasn't hers, it was Ruth's, and she said it proud, and Cliff had to step away for a minute when she said it, and everyone let him. They didn't get forever. Nobody does, and they knew it better than most, which is maybe why they didn't waste a day of it. They got 6 years. 6 years of morning coffee on the porch, of slow walks up Sycamore Road, of him learning to bake that pie himself, badly at first and then not badly at all, his big rancher's hands learning the lattice crust. 6 years of 2 houses at the end of a dead-end road with the lights on in both of them, every single night. Cliff went first, in the winter in his sleep, with Alina beside him and his hand in hers. Peaceful. 80% of a good life is going out easy with somebody holding your hand, and he got that, and he'd have told you he didn't deserve it, and he'd have been wrong. Alina buried her second good man, and this time the house wasn't so unbearably big because it was full of 6 years, and because half the town came, and because she was not the same woman who'd sat in the dark after Tom. She knew now what she hadn't known then. She knew the door opens. She knew a small thing, a pie, a knock, a note on a porch, can pull a person all the way back from the edge of the world. She lived a good while after. And every fall, when the apples came in on the tree Cliff proposed under, she'd bake that pie, Ruth's pie, their pie, and she'd wrap one in a faded blue dish towel and carry it slower every year to whatever house on whatever road had gone dark and quiet and stopped believing in tomorrow. Because that's the whole thing in the end. That's what she'd learned. You just have to remind somebody the door still opens. You knock. You hold out the pie. You climb in the ambulance in your housecoat. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave and very old, The thing you find waiting on the other side of that door is the rest of your life. That lands at roughly 4,995 words. The hook is untouched at 150 words and every key beat survives. The recipe box note, the ambulance, and "Yes, I'm coming," the hospital confession, the church kitchen line, the spring proposal, the 6 years, and the closing. The cuts came from doubled expository phrases in the setup and resolution. No beats removed, only compression.